At Christmas, I decided to give $2 million as a present to my newly married daughter to start her life. During the dinner, my son-in-law introduced me to his parents. This is the useless old man who lives off us. I simply stood up, grabbed my sweater, and replied, "I left a gift for you on the bed." Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Lionel, and at 61 years old, I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like. I was wrong. The snow was falling gently outside Sloane's house that Christmas evening, creating the perfect backdrop for what should have been a beautiful family gathering. I sat in my old Toyota in the driveway for a few minutes, staring at the warm lights glowing through the windows, listening to the faint sound of laughter coming from inside. In my coat pocket, carefully folded, was an envelope containing a check for $2 million. My Christmas gift to my daughter and her husband, Carlton. My way of giving them the fresh start I never had. I'd been saving for this moment for 3 years. Every Social Security payment, every dollar from my small pension, every penny I could scrape together had gone toward this gift. I'd eaten ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I could count, worn the same 3 shirts until the collars frayed, and walked everywhere to save on gas. But it would all be worth it to see Sloane's face when she opened that envelope. The front door opened before I could even knock. "Dad, you made it." Sloane's voice was bright, cheerful, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite place. She hugged me briefly, the kind of hug you give someone out of obligation, rather than affection. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart," I said, following her into the warmth of the house. The living room was decorated beautifully. A massive Christmas tree in the corner, garland draped over the mantel, and the smell of roasted turkey filling the air. Carlton was standing by the fireplace, drink in hand, talking to an older couple I didn't recognize. He barely glanced in my direction when I entered. "Dad, come meet Carlton's parents," Sloane said, guiding me toward the group. "They're visiting from Connecticut." As we approached, I heard Carlton's voice, rich and confident. "Oh, perfect timing," he said, turning toward us with that smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mom, Dad, I want you to meet someone special." My heart swelled for a moment. After 2 years of cold shoulders and barely concealed irritation, maybe Carlton was finally ready to accept me as family. "This is the old man I was telling you about," Carlton continued, his arm sweeping toward me in a grand gesture. "This is Lionel, the useless old guy who lives off us." Ha! The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face flush hot, then cold. The envelope in my pocket suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Carlton's mother, a well-dressed woman with perfectly styled gray hair, looked me up and down with obvious distaste. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "How charitable of you both." Carlton's father nodded gravely. "It's admirable when young people take care of the elderly, even when they're burdensome." I stood there frozen, feeling like I was outside my own body watching this nightmare unfold. The worst part wasn't Carlton's cruelty. I'd grown accustomed to his passive aggression over the months I'd been staying with them. The worst part was watching Sloane's reaction. She laughed, not a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable giggle, a genuine, amused laugh, as if Carlton had just told the funniest joke she'd ever heard. "Dad's been with us for almost a year now," she said to Carlton's parents, her voice taking on that apologetic tone I'd heard her use when explaining away embarrassing relatives. "We couldn't just let him end up in some state facility, you know." My throat constricted. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to tell them about the envelope in my pocket that would change their lives. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there while my own daughter treated me like a charity case in front of strangers. Carlton clapped me on the shoulder with false joviality. "Don't worry, folks. He's mostly harmless, just sits in his room watching old movies and complaining about his aches and pains." More laughter from the group. Sloane was actually beaming, like she was proud of Carlton's wit. I looked around the room, taking in the expensive furniture, the designer decorations, the open bottles of wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. All of it paid for by their combined 6-figure salaries. Yet somehow I was the one living off them. "Well," Carlton's mother said, raising her wine glass, "here's to young people with generous hearts." They all toasted to generosity, to charity, to taking care of the useless old man. I excused myself to the bathroom, my legs feeling weak beneath me. In the mirror, I saw an old man with tired eyes and wrinkled clothes. Is this really how they saw me? Is this what I'd become? When I returned to the living room, dinner was being served. I was seated at the far end of the table, away from the main conversation. Throughout the meal, I listened to Carlton regale his parents with stories about his job, their recent vacation to Mexico, their plans to renovate the kitchen. Sloane hung on his every word, laughing at his jokes, touching his arm affectionately. I might as well have been invisible. As dessert was being served, I quietly stood up and walked to their bedroom. I placed the envelope on Sloane's nightstand, right where she'd see it when she went to bed. Inside was not just the check, but a letter I'd written explaining how proud I was of her, how much I loved her, and how I hoped this money would give them the security to start a family and build the life they deserved. I returned to the living room and picked up my coat from the chair by the door. "Dad?" Sloane looked up from her conversation. "Where are you going?" "I left a present for you two upstairs," I said quietly. "On your nightstand." "Oh, you didn't have to," she started, but her attention was already drifting back to Carlton's story about some client at his law firm. I looked at her one more time, memorizing her face. My little girl who used to climb into my lap and ask me to read her stories, who used to tell me I was her hero, who used to draw me pictures that said, "World's Best Daddy" in crayon letters. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," I whispered, but she didn't hear me. I walked out into the snow, got in my car, and drove away. But as I reached the end of their street, I realized something had fundamentally changed inside me. The crushing weight of humiliation was still there, but underneath it, something else was growing. Something harder, something that had been dormant for too long. The man who had just been dismissed as a useless old burden had forgotten who he used to be. But sitting in that car with the taste of betrayal bitter in my mouth, I was beginning to remember, and they had no idea what they'd just awakened. The drive back to my small apartment took me through neighborhoods I used to call home. Every street corner held a memory I'd tried to bury, every traffic light a reminder of the life I'd lost. As I pulled into the parking lot of the rundown complex where I'd been living for the past year, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. When had I become so small? My apartment was a studio on the third floor with thin walls and a radiator that clanged all night. The furniture was secondhand, the carpet stained, and the whole place smelled faintly of the fish the guy next door cooked every evening. It was a far cry from the sprawling suburban home where I'd raised Sloane, but it was what I could afford on my meager income. Or at least, that's what I'd let everyone believe. I sat on my narrow bed and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the contacts until I found the number I was looking for. James Patterson, my financial advisor for the past 15 years. It was nearly midnight on Christmas, but James had told me years ago to call him anytime, day or night. "Lionel?" His voice was groggy but alert. "Everything okay?" "I need to know the current total," I said quietly. There was a pause. "Are you sure? We agreed you wouldn't check on this for at least—" "I need to know, James." I heard the sound of papers rustling, computer keys clicking. "As of market close yesterday, your portfolio is worth approximately $47.3 million. The number should have brought me comfort, but instead it made my stomach turn. $47 million sitting in carefully managed accounts. While my daughter and her husband saw me as a financial burden, they were generous enough to tolerate." "Lionel, what's going on?" James's voice cut through my thoughts. "You sound different." "How long have we known each other, James?" 15 years, since right after the divorce. And in all that time, have I ever asked you for anything unreasonable? Never. You've been the most conservative client I've ever had. Sometimes I worry you're too conservative, actually. With your wealth, you could be living like what? Another pause. Like someone who earned every penny of what he has. I walked to my small window and looked out at the parking lot below. A broken streetlight flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the cracked asphalt. How had I gone from corner offices and boardrooms to this? More importantly, why had I let myself? The answer was sitting in a photo on my nightstand. It was taken 6 years ago at Sloane's college graduation. In it, she's beaming in her cap and gown, her arm around my waist looking at me like I hung the moon. That was back when she still called me Daddy, back when she still needed me. "Mr. Patterson," I said into the phone, "I want you to pull up the Morrison file." "The industrial investment?" "Lionel, we've been over this. That deal has been dormant for—" "It's not dormant. It's been waiting." "Parley." 25 years ago, I'd bought a controlling interest in a small manufacturing company in Ohio. The owner, Bill Morrison, had been desperate to sell after his son died in an accident, and I'd paid well above market value out of sympathy. What I hadn't expected was for that little company to become the primary supplier for 3 major automotive manufacturers. The quarterly dividends alone from Morrison Industries were more than most people made in a year. But I'd had James reinvest every penny back into the business. Bill had retired to Florida a decade ago, leaving the day-to-day operations to a management team that thought they were reporting to some faceless investment group. They had no idea their actual owner was living in a studio apartment, eating ramen noodles, and being treated like a charity case by his own family. "The Morrison quarterly board meeting is next month," James continued. "Did you want me to attend on your behalf, as usual?" "No," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "I think it's time I attended in person." After I hung up with James, I lay back on my narrow bed and let my mind wander to the years after my divorce from Margaret, Sloane's mother. The settlement had been brutal. She'd gotten the house, half my assets, and full custody of 10-year-old Sloane. I'd been left with visitation rights every other weekend and a broken heart that felt like it would never heal. Those early years were the darkest of my life. I'd thrown myself into work, building my business empire not out of ambition, but out of desperate need to prove I was still worth something. Every deal I closed, every company I acquired, every million I earned was an attempt to fill the void left by my daughter's absence. But success in business meant long hours, missed calls, and postponed visits. Sloane's birthdays came and went with expensive gifts delivered by assistants instead of hugs from her father. Her school plays happened while I was in boardrooms. Her first heartbreak occurred while I was on a business trip to Singapore. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. Margaret had remarried, a kind, stable man who coached Sloane's soccer team and helped with her homework. In Sloane's teenage eyes, he was the father she deserved, and I was the stranger who showed up with guilt gifts and awkward small talk. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years building wealth to prove I was worthy of love, only to discover that love can't be bought, only earned through presence, patience, and time, things I'd failed to give when they mattered most. When Margaret died in a car accident 3 years ago, I thought it might be my chance to reconnect with Sloane. She was struggling with grief, and her stepfather had moved to Arizona to be closer to his own grandchildren. For the first time in years, she needed me. But the woman who called asking for help wasn't the little girl who used to braid my hair with ribbons. She was a polished 30-year-old attorney with a corner office and an MBA husband who looked at me like I was an inconvenience. When I offered to help with Margaret's funeral expenses, Sloane accepted with the detached politeness she might show a helpful stranger. That's when I made the decision that led me to this moment. I liquidated my most visible assets, moved out of my penthouse, and began living like a man of modest means. If Sloane was going to accept me into her life, it would be because she wanted her father around, not because she wanted access to his money. For a year, I'd played the role of the struggling retiree. I'd let Carlton's snide comments slide, tolerated Sloane's patronizing kindness, and swallowed my pride every time they spoke about me like I was a burden. I told myself it was temporary, that once they saw I was a loving father instead of a walking wallet, the real relationship would begin. Tonight had taught me how naive I'd been. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sloane. "Dad, thank you so much for the generous gift. Carlton and I are overwhelmed. We'll call you tomorrow to discuss how best to use it. Love you." Generous gift. $2 million was a generous gift, but not for the reasons she thought. I'd given them my heart, along with that check, and they'd received it as charity from a pathetic old man. I walked to my closet and pulled out a box I hadn't touched in over a year. Inside were my old business cards, cufflinks that cost more than my monthly rent, and a photo from the Wall Street Journal when Morrison Industries went public. In that photo, I looked like a man who commanded respect, who built empires, who never apologized for taking up space in the world. Tomorrow, I would start remembering who that man was. Tonight, I would mourn the relationship with my daughter that I'd never actually had, only imagined I could buy. But first, I had some phone calls to make. Some very important phone calls to people who still remembered when Lionel Matthews was a name that meant something. Because if my own family wanted to treat me like a useless old man, it was time to remind them exactly what kind of power a useless old man could wield. The game was just beginning, and they had no idea they were playing with someone who'd never lost a battle that truly mattered to him. Until now, Sloane had mattered more than winning. That was about to change. The call from Sloane came 3 days after Christmas. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, eating scrambled eggs and reviewing some financial documents James had sent over, when my phone rang. "Dad, we need to talk." Her voice was different somehow, tighter, more controlled than the cheerful text she'd sent Christmas night. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? Can you come over this afternoon? Carlton and I want to discuss some things with you." There was something in her tone that made my stomach clench. "What kind of things?" "Just come over around 2, okay? We'll explain everything then." She hung up before I could ask any more questions. I arrived at their house at exactly 2 o'clock, parking in the same spot I'd occupied Christmas night. But this time, there were no warm lights glowing in the windows, no sounds of laughter. The house looked cold, unwelcoming. Carlton answered the door, but his usual fake smile was nowhere to be seen. "Lionel," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "Come in. Sloane's in the living room." I found my daughter sitting on the couch, her posture rigid, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The coffee table was covered with papers, bank statements, printouts, what looked like medical documents. "Dad, sit down," Sloane said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "We need to have a serious conversation." I sat down slowly, my eyes scanning the papers. "What's all this?" Carlton took a seat next to Sloane, his arm sliding protectively around her shoulders. "Lionel, we're concerned about you, your mental state, your financial decisions. This Christmas gift you gave us, it's not normal behavior for someone in your situation." "My situation?" Sloane leaned forward, her voice taking on the gentle tone you might use with a confused child. "Dad, you can't afford to give away $2 million. You're living on Social Security and a small pension. Where did this money even come from?" I felt a cold shock run through me. "What do you mean? Where did it come from?" "We called your bank," Carlton said, his voice carrying a note of accusation. "That check was drawn from an account that should have maybe $30,000 in it, based on your income. Either you've been hiding money from us, or you're having some kind of mental episode that made you think you had funds you don't actually have." My mouth went dry. "You called my bank?" "As your power of attorney," Sloane said, pulling a document from the pile on the coffee table. "I have the right to monitor your finances when I'm concerned about your well-being." The paper she held up made my blood freeze. It was a power of attorney document dated 6 months ago with my signature at the bottom. I had no memory of signing it. "When did I sign this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sloane and Carlton exchanged a glance. "You don't remember?" she asked, her voice full of fake concern. "Dad, you signed it in June when you had that little spell. You were so confused that day, talking about people who weren't there, forgetting where you were. Dr. Henderson said it was probably just exhaustion, but Carlton and I thought it would be wise to have legal safeguards in place." I stared at the document, my mind racing. I remembered the day she was talking about. I'd been helping them move furniture, and I'd gotten overheated and dizzy. Sloane had insisted on taking me to the doctor, even though I'd felt fine after sitting in the air conditioning for a few minutes. Dr. Henderson had said it was nothing serious, just dehydration. But I didn't remember signing anything. I definitely didn't remember agreeing to give my daughter control over my finances. "The check bounced, Dad," Carlton said, his voice harder now. "You embarrassed us. We had to explain to the bank that you're not well." "Not well?" The early stages of dementia can cause delusions of wealth, Sloane said, consulting another paper. Dr. Henderson mentioned it as a possibility. People start to believe they have access to money they don't actually have. My head was spinning. Dr. Henderson never said anything about dementia to me. He wouldn't, Carlton explained with exaggerated patience. Patients in your condition often don't remember conversations clearly. That's why we've been handling your medical appointments lately. I looked around the room, trying to process what was happening. The expensive furniture, the designer decorations, the renovated kitchen I could see through the doorway, all of it suddenly took on a different meaning. "How long have you been monitoring my finances?" I asked. Another exchange of glances between them. "Since you moved in with us," Sloane said. "We've been managing your bills, making sure you don't make any dangerous financial decisions. The account you wrote that check from? We've been the ones keeping it funded." "Funded how?" "Your Social Security gets direct deposited there," Carlton said. "Plus, we've been supplementing it from our own income to make sure you have enough for your medications and personal expenses." The room seemed to tilt around me. According to them, I was a senile old man whose own daughter had been financially supporting him while he suffered from delusions of wealth. The $2 million check wasn't a generous gift from a loving father. It was the confused scribbling of a man losing his mind. But I knew better. I remembered every business deal, every investment, every decision that had built my fortune. I could recite account numbers, recall board meetings from 5 years ago, quote, stock prices from memory. There was nothing wrong with my mind, which meant there was something very wrong with this situation. "I want to see my bank statements," I said quietly. "Dad, we've been over this, all of them. I want to see every statement for the past year." Sloane sighed, the sound of someone dealing with a difficult patient. "We can go through them together if it will make you feel better. But Dad, you need to understand, we're trying to protect you. From yourself, if necessary." She pulled out a thick folder of bank statements and spread them across the coffee table. I leaned forward, studying the numbers. The account showed regular deposits from Social Security, about $1,800 a month. Then monthly deposits of another $3,200, labeled as family support. The account balance never went above $40,000. But I knew this wasn't my real account. This was some kind of allowance account they'd set up to make me think I was poor. "Where are the statements for my investment accounts?" I asked. Carlton laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Dad, you don't have investment accounts. This is what we've been trying to tell you." "Audius, what about Morrison Industries?" The silence that followed my question was deafening. Sloane's face went pale, and Carlton's jaw tightened. "How do you know that name?" Carlton asked slowly. "Because I own it." They stared at me like I just claimed to own the moon. Then Sloane reached over and took my hand, her voice gentle and patronizing. "Dad, Morrison Industries is a major corporation. It's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You can't possibly think you own something like that." But I could see it in their eyes. They knew exactly what Morrison Industries was, and they knew I had some connection to it. The question was, how much did they know? "I think we should call Dr. Henderson," Carlton said, reaching for his phone. "This level of delusion is concerning." "No," I said, standing up abruptly. "I think I should leave." "Dad, please," Sloane said, rising to follow me. "We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help. But these fantasies about owning companies, about having millions of dollars, it's not healthy." I turned to look at her, my daughter, who I'd loved more than life itself, who I'd worked myself to exhaustion to provide for, who I'd given everything to protect and support. The woman standing in front of me was a stranger wearing Sloane's face. "When did I become such a burden to you?" I asked. Her expression softened slightly. "You're not a burden, Dad. You're family. That's why we're taking care of you. Taking care of me." The words should have been comforting, but they felt like a death sentence. In their minds, I wasn't a father anymore. I was a responsibility, a confused old man who needed to be managed and controlled for his own good. As I drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I began to understand the full scope of what was happening. Somehow, they'd gained legal control over my finances. They'd convinced a doctor that I was mentally incompetent. They'd isolated me from my own money, my own life, my own identity. The worst part was how carefully orchestrated it all seemed. The power of attorney I didn't remember signing. The bank account that showed exactly what they wanted it to show. The medical concerns that justified their control. They weren't just stealing from me, they were erasing me. When I got back to my apartment, I immediately called James Patterson. "Lionel, thank God," he said when he heard my voice. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Someone's been calling my office claiming to be your daughter, asking questions about your portfolio." My blood turned to ice. What kind of questions? They wanted to know about your assets, your account balances, your investment strategy. They said you'd given them power of attorney, and they needed to understand your financial situation for tax purposes. What did you tell them? Nothing. Our confidentiality agreement prevents me from discussing your finances with anyone without written authorization from you personally. But Lionel, if someone is trying to gain access to your accounts, I sank into my chair, the full picture finally becoming clear. They didn't just want to control my small monthly allowance, they wanted access to everything. $47 million was enough to set them up for life, to pay off Carlton's law school loans, to buy the kind of lifestyle they felt entitled to. And they'd been working on this plan for months, maybe longer. The power of attorney, the medical concerns, the isolation from my real financial advisors, it was all part of a carefully constructed trap designed to make me disappear. The only thing they hadn't counted on was that I still had friends in high places. People who remembered when Lionel Matthews was someone you couldn't push around. It was time to remind my daughter and her husband exactly who they were trying to destroy. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I put on my best suit. It was a charcoal gray Armani that still fit perfectly, purchased during better times when I commanded boardrooms instead of hiding in studio apartments. As I adjusted the tie in my bathroom mirror, I saw glimpses of the man I used to be, the one who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd never backed down from a fight, who'd forgotten how to be afraid. My first stop was downtown, to the law offices of Morrison, Kelly and Associates. Not the small family practice where Sloane worked, but the prestigious firm that had handled my business for over 2 decades. The receptionist's eyes widened when I walked in. "Mr. Matthews, we haven't seen you in so long. Is everything all right?" "I need to see Patricia Morrison," I said. "Tell her it's urgent." Patricia had been my attorney since before Sloane was born. She'd handled my divorce, my business acquisitions, and had been the one to set up the complex trust structures that protected my wealth. If anyone would understand the gravity of what was happening, it would be her. "Lionel," she said, rising from her chair when I entered her office, "you look different. I need you to review something." I handed her copies of the power of attorney documents Sloane had shown me. "Tell me if these are legitimate." Patricia studied the papers with the sharp eye that had made her one of the most respected attorneys in the state. After several minutes, she looked up with a frown. "This is your signature," she said slowly. "But Lionel, this document gives your daughter almost unlimited control over your finances. Why would you sign something like this?" "I don't remember signing it." Her frown deepened. "When was this supposedly executed?" "June 15th, according to the date. Sloane says I was having some kind of mental episode." Patricia pulled out a thick file from her cabinet and began flipping through papers. "June 15th, here we are. You were in my office on June 15th discussing the Morrison Industries quarterly report. We met for over 2 hours. You were completely lucid, sharp as ever. I have detailed notes of our conversation." My stomach clenched. "What time was our meeting?" 10 a.m. to noon. According to this power of attorney, you supposedly signed it at 2 p.m. that same day in the presence of Dr. Henderson." We stared at each other across her desk, the implications hanging heavy in the air. "Patricia," I said quietly, "I think my daughter is trying to steal my estate." For the next hour, we went through every document Sloane had shown me. Patricia's analysis was devastating. The power of attorney had been notarized, but the notary's signature looked suspicious. The medical evaluation from Dr. Henderson contained language that didn't match his usual reports. Most damning of all, the account statements I'd been shown were completely fabricated. They've created a parallel financial reality, Patricia explained. On paper, you appear to be exactly what they claim, a retiree living on Social Security with a daughter supplementing his income. But your real assets are still protected by the trust structures we set up years ago. They can't access those without triggering multiple security protocols. So why haven't they tried? Because they don't know about them. The trust documents list you as LM Holdings, not Lionel Matthews. Unless they had access to my files or James Patterson's records, they'd have no way of knowing the connection. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by a darker emotion. They're planning something bigger. What do you mean? I told her about the phone calls to James's office, about Sloane's questions regarding my investments, about the way they'd been isolating me from my real financial advisors. Patricia's expression grew grim. Lionel, I think they're building a case for guardianship. If they can convince a court that you're mentally incompetent, they could gain control over everything, not just your monthly allowance, but your entire estate. The words hit me like a physical blow. Guardianship meant I would legally become a child in the eyes of the law. Sloane would have the power to make every decision about my life, where I lived, what medical treatment I received, how my money was spent. I would cease to exist as an independent person. How close are they to succeeding? Closer than I'd like. They have the power of attorney, which gives them standing to petition the court. They have medical documentation suggesting cognitive decline. If they can show a pattern of erratic financial behavior, like writing a $2 million check I couldn't afford. Exactly. From the outside, it looks like a textbook case of someone who needs protection from himself. Okay, I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. What are my options? Patricia pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. First, we revoke the power of attorney immediately. I'll prepare the paperwork today. Second, we need to document your mental competency with independent medical evaluations. Third, we go on the offensive. What do you mean? If they've been misrepresenting your financial situation, accessing your accounts without authorization, and forging documents, they've committed multiple felonies. We could have them arrested. The thought of Sloane in handcuffs made my chest tighten. Despite everything she'd done, she was still my daughter. I don't want to destroy her life. Lionel, she's trying to destroy yours. That afternoon I drove to the offices of Morrison Industries. The building was exactly as I remembered, 15 stories of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district. I'd designed it myself, down to the marble floors and the abstract sculptures in the lobby. The security guard looked surprised when I approached his desk. Can I help you, sir? I'm here for the executive committee meeting. I'm sorry, sir, but that meeting is private. Only board members and senior management. I handed him my driver's license. Check the ownership registry. He frowned, then picked up his phone and made a quiet call. A few minutes later, his expression changed completely. Mr. Matthews, I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize you. Please, take the executive elevator to the 15th floor. The elevator ride to the top felt like traveling back in time. When the doors opened, I was greeted by Sarah Chen, the company's current CEO, a brilliant woman I'd promoted from the engineering department 5 years ago. Mr. Matthews, she said, extending her hand. This is unexpected. Is everything all right? I need to review our current financial position, I said, and I need to understand who's been asking questions about me. Her expression grew concerned. Someone claiming to be your daughter called last week. She said she was handling your affairs due to health concerns. We didn't give her any information, of course, but she was quite persistent. We spent the next 2 hours in the boardroom, going over quarterly reports and financial projections. Morrison Industries was thriving. Annual revenues had grown to over $800 million, and my personal stake was worth more than I'd realized. The quarterly dividend payments alone were nearly $2 million. There's something else you should know, Sarah said as our meeting concluded. We've had inquiries from a law firm about potential acquisition opportunities. Someone's been asking very specific questions about our ownership structure. What law firm? Brennan and Associates. The lawyer who called said he was representing a client interested in manufacturing investments. My blood turned cold. Carlton worked for Brennan and Associates. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by financial documents and legal papers. The scope of their plan was becoming clear. They weren't just trying to steal my money, they were trying to steal my entire identity, my life's work, everything I'd built. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Marcus Reynolds. Marcus, it's Lionel Matthews. There was a pause. Marcus Reynolds was a private investigator who'd helped me with due diligence on several acquisitions. He was also known for being completely discreet and utterly ruthless when the situation called for it. Lionel? Jesus, where have you been? I heard rumors you'd lost everything in some kind of mental breakdown. Rumors started by people who wanted me to disappear. I need your help, Marcus. Someone's been playing a very dangerous game, and it's time to change the rules. By midnight, I had a plan. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't gentle, but it was thorough. Patricia would handle the legal aspects, James would secure my financial assets, and Marcus would gather the evidence I needed to prove what they'd been doing. But there was one more element to my strategy, something that would hit them where it hurt most. Carlton worked for a prestigious law firm that prided itself on ethical conduct. Sloane was a junior partner at a family practice that depended on community trust. Their professional reputations were their most valuable assets. They'd tried to destroy mine. Now it was time to return the favor. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I thought about the envelope I'd left on Sloane's nightstand Christmas night. The letter inside had been full of love, pride, and hope for our future relationship. Tomorrow, I would write a very different kind of letter, one that would show them exactly what kind of man they'd chosen to cross. The game was no longer about money or control. It was about survival. And they'd just declared war on someone who'd never lost a battle that mattered. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after my visit to Patricia's office. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing the evidence Marcus had compiled when Sloane's number appeared on my screen. "Dad, we need you to come over immediately." Her voice was different, urgent, almost panicked. "There's been a problem with your accounts." "What kind of problem?" "Just come over. Carlton's here, and we have some people we need you to meet." When I arrived at their house 20 minutes later, I found 3 additional cars in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see several people in suits sitting in the living room. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to walk calmly to the front door. Carlton answered before I could knock, his expression a mixture of fake concern and barely concealed satisfaction. "Lionel, thank you for coming so quickly. We have some serious issues to discuss." The living room had been transformed into what looked like an intervention. Sloane sat on the couch, surrounded by official-looking documents. Across from her sat Dr. Henderson, looking uncomfortable in his rumpled suit. Next to him was a woman I didn't recognize, holding a briefcase and wearing the kind of severe expression that screamed, "Government bureaucrat." "Dad, please sit down," Sloane said, gesturing to a chair that had been positioned directly in front of the group. It felt like facing a firing squad. "What's going on here?" The woman with the briefcase spoke first. "Mr. Matthews, I'm Linda Carson from Adult Protective Services. We've received some concerning reports about your recent behavior." My blood turned cold, but I kept my voice steady. "What kind of reports?" Dr. Henderson cleared his throat. "Lionel, your daughter is worried about you." "The incident with the check last week, combined with some other troubling behaviors, suggests you may be experiencing cognitive decline more severe than we initially thought." "What other troubling behaviors?" Carlton pulled out a folder thick with papers. "You've been making strange phone calls, claiming to own companies that don't exist, insisting you have access to millions of dollars. Yesterday you apparently went to some office building downtown and convinced them you were someone in charge. The Morrison Industries visit. They'd been watching me." "Dad," Sloane said, her voice gentle but firm, "we can't stand by and watch you hurt yourself, or potentially hurt others with these delusions." Linda Carson opened her briefcase and pulled out official forms. "Mr. Matthews, based on the medical evaluation and family testimony, we're recommending immediate assessment for emergency guardianship. This would be temporary, just until we can ensure your safety and well-being." The words hit me like a physical blow. Emergency guardianship meant they could have me committed to a facility within hours, with no opportunity for me to defend myself. My assets would be frozen, my freedom would be gone, and I would be trapped in their version of reality. "I want to call my lawyer," I said quietly. "Of course," Linda Carson said. "But you should understand that resisting this process could be seen as further evidence of your compromised mental state." I looked around the room at these people who were calmly discussing erasing my existence. Dr. Henderson wouldn't meet my eyes. Linda Carson was already filling out forms. Carlton was practically glowing with satisfaction. And Sloane, my daughter, my little girl, was watching me with the cold calculation of someone who'd already written me off. "Before we proceed," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket, "I have something I think everyone should see." I pulled out a manila envelope and set it on the coffee table. "This contains some interesting documents my private investigator compiled over the past week." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Carlton's face went pale. "What private investigator?" I opened the envelope and spread the contents across the coffee table. Bank records showing unauthorized access attempts to my real accounts. Phone logs proving Carlton had been calling my financial advisors under false pretenses. Most damning of all, a forensic analysis of the power of attorney document showing clear evidence of forgery. "This is impossible," Sloane whispered, staring at the papers. "You don't have money for private investigators. You don't have access to these kinds of records." "That's where you made your first mistake," I said calmly. "You assumed I was exactly what you wanted me to be, a confused old man with no resources and no friends." I turned to Dr. Henderson. "Doctor, when you examined me in June, did I show any signs of cognitive impairment?" He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, your daughter expressed concern. Did I personally show any signs of confusion, memory loss, or delusional thinking during our appointment?" Not specifically, but family members often notice symptoms that—" "Yes or no, doctor?" A long pause. "No, you seemed completely lucid during our examination." I turned to Linda Carson. "Ms. Carson, I assume you've reviewed Dr. Henderson's actual report from that visit?" She frowned, shuffling through her papers. "I have the summary provided by the family, not the summary, the actual medical report." I pulled another document from my envelope. "This is Dr. Henderson's original report from June 15th. Please read the highlighted section aloud." Her face went white as she read. "Patient shows no signs of cognitive impairment. Mental status examination within normal limits. Family concerns appear unfounded at this time." The silence that followed was deafening. "There seems to be some discrepancy," Linda Carson said slowly, "between the original medical report and the information provided to our office." Carlton jumped to his feet. "This is ridiculous. He's obviously coached people, bribed them somehow. Look at him. He's living in a studio apartment eating cat food. How could he possibly afford private investigators and lawyers?" That's when I smiled for the first time since entering the house. "Would you like to know how I can afford it, Carlton?" I pulled out my phone and dialed a number. "Sarah, it's Lionel. Are you available for a conference call? I have some people here who need clarification about my financial situation." The phone rang twice before Sarah Chen's voice filled the room through the speaker. "Of course, Mr. Matthews. How can I help?" "Sarah, could you please identify yourself for the people in this room?" "I'm Sarah Chen, CEO of Morrison Industries, Mr. Matthews is our majority shareholder and chairman of the board." The effect was immediate and devastating. Dr. Henderson's mouth fell open. Linda Carson stared at the phone like it might explode. Carlton looked like he'd been struck by lightning, but it was Sloane's reaction that hurt the most. The blood drained from her face, and she looked at me with an expression of pure horror, not because she'd been caught, but because she'd finally realized what she'd tried to steal. "Sarah," I continued, "what is the current value of Morrison Industries?" Our last quarterly valuation put the company at approximately $2.8 billion. Mr. Matthews owns 51% of the outstanding shares. More silence. The kind of silence that follows the detonation of a nuclear bomb. "Thank you, Sarah. We'll talk later." I hung up and looked around the room. Now, does anyone still think I'm a delusional old man who can't afford legal representation? Linda Carson was frantically gathering her papers. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. Mr. Matthews, I apologize, but based on this new information, I need to reassess the entire situation. You do that, I said calmly. And while you're reassessing, you might want to investigate how a family managed to forge power of attorney documents and submit false medical reports to initiate guardianship proceedings against a competent adult. She practically ran from the house, Dr. Henderson close behind her. That left me alone with Sloane and Carlton. Dad, Sloane whispered, her voice breaking, I don't understand. If you have all this money, why were you living like... Why did you let us think? Because I wanted to know if you loved me for who I am or for what I could give you. I stood up, looking down at the two people who'd tried to destroy me. Now I have my answer. Carlton's shock was rapidly transforming into rage. This is fraud. You deliberately deceived us about your financial situation. You made us think we were supporting you when you're worth billions. I never asked for your support, I said quietly. I never told you I was poor. You assumed that, and then you used those assumptions to justify treating me like garbage. We took care of you. You controlled me. You isolated me. You tried to steal my identity, my assets, and my freedom. I picked up the forged power of attorney document. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I was so far gone that I'd just disappear quietly? Sloane was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone who'd just realized they'd lost everything. What happens now? She asked. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and tried to find some trace of the little girl who used to think I hung the moon, but all I saw was a stranger who'd been willing to destroy her own father for money she thought she deserved. Now, I said, walking toward the door, you get to live with the consequences of your choices. Dad, wait. I turned back one last time. Patricia Morrison will be in touch about the criminal charges. I'd suggest you both get very good lawyers. As I walked out of that house, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Freedom, not just from their manipulation and control, but from the desperate need to be loved by people who were incapable of loving anyone but themselves. The hardest lesson I'd ever learned was that sometimes the people who should cherish you the most are the ones who'll hurt you the deepest. But I'd learned something else too, that you can survive having your heart broken by the people you love most and come out stronger on the other side. Behind me, I could hear Sloane calling my name, her voice growing more desperate with each step I took away from her. But I didn't look back. Some bridges once burned should stay that way. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new penthouse apartment watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and amber. The view was spectacular, 20 floors above the chaos below, with nothing but sky and possibilities stretching out before me. It had taken exactly 3 weeks for the criminal charges to destroy Carlton's career. Brennan and Associates had terminated him immediately upon learning about the forged documents and attempted fraud. The State Bar Association was reviewing his license. Last I heard, he was working at a small firm that specialized in traffic tickets and divorce cases. Sloane had fared slightly better, but not by much. Her family practice had quietly asked her to take a leave of absence while the investigation proceeded. The legal community was smaller than people realized, and word traveled fast about lawyers who couldn't be trusted. But I took no satisfaction in their downfall. Revenge, I'd discovered, was a hollow victory when it came at the cost of your own soul. The doorbell chimed, interrupting my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, I found Marcus Reynolds standing in the hallway with a manila envelope in his hand. "One last delivery," he said, handing me the envelope. "The final documentation you requested." Inside were the papers that would officially close this chapter of my life. Sloane and Carlton had agreed to a plea bargain. Community service, restitution, and permanent restraining orders, preventing them from contacting me or attempting to access my finances. In exchange, they would avoid jail time. "How do you feel about it?" Marcus asked. I thought about the question for a long moment. "Relieved," I said finally. "It's over." After Marcus left, I called James Patterson, "Lionel, perfect timing," he said when he answered. "I just finished reviewing the Morrison Industries quarterly report. Your dividends this quarter are going to be substantial. What would you like me to do with the funds?" For the past 6 months, I'd been thinking about that question. What did a 71-year-old man with more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes actually need? "I want to set up a foundation," I said. "Something focused on protecting elderly people from financial abuse." "That's a wonderful idea. What kind of scope are you thinking?" "Legal aid for seniors who can't afford representation, education programs about elder fraud. Maybe some kind of support network for people who've been victimized by their own families." Because that was the thing I'd learned through this nightmare. I wasn't the only one. Marcus's investigation had uncovered dozens of similar cases. Elderly people who'd been manipulated, controlled, and robbed by the very people they'd trusted most. Most of them didn't have the resources to fight back, but they would now. That afternoon, I had lunch with Patricia Morrison to discuss the foundation's legal structure. We met at a small cafe downtown, far from the expensive restaurants where I used to conduct business. I'd learned to appreciate simpler pleasures. "Have you given any thought to what you'll call it?" Patricia asked, reviewing the preliminary paperwork. "The Margaret Matthews Foundation," I said without hesitation. Patricia looked up in surprise. "After your ex-wife?" I nodded. Margaret had been many things: bitter, vindictive, manipulative during our divorce. But she'd never tried to steal my identity or erase my existence. And despite our problems, she'd raised Sloane to be intelligent and capable. The fact that our daughter had chosen to use those abilities for destruction wasn't Margaret's fault. "She deserves to be remembered for something positive," I explained. 2 weeks later, I was in Patricia's office signing the final papers when her secretary knocked on the door. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's a woman here asking to see Mr. Matthews. She says she's his daughter." My hand froze over the signature line. "Tell her I'm not available." "Sir, she says it's urgent, something about her mother's grave." I looked at Patricia, who shrugged. "It's your choice, Lionel." Part of me wanted to walk out the back door and pretend I'd never heard Sloane's name. But another part, the part that had loved her unconditionally for 35 years, needed to know what she wanted. "Send her in." Sloane looked different when she entered the office. Thinner, older, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. She was wearing a simple dress instead of her usual designer suits, and her wedding ring was gone. "Hello, Dad." "Sloane." She sat down in the chair across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Thank you for seeing me. I know you have no reason to." I said nothing, waiting. "Carlton left," she said quietly. 3 months ago. He said he couldn't handle the stress, the shame. He took what little money we had left and moved to California." "I'm sorry." She looked up in surprise. "Are you?" "You're my daughter. I don't want you to suffer, even after everything that happened." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I went to Mom's grave yesterday. The first time since the funeral. I sat there for hours, trying to understand how I became the kind of person who would destroy her own father. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. "She always said you were a good man who'd lost his way," Sloane continued. "I used to think she was making excuses for you for all the times you weren't there when I needed you. But sitting by her headstone, I realized something." "What's that?" "I became exactly what I accused you of being, someone who put money and status above family, someone who was so focused on what I thought I deserved that I forgot about what really mattered." The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of hurt and misunderstanding. "What do you want, Sloane?" "Nothing," she said, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, her voice was steady. "I didn't come here to ask for money or forgiveness or another chance. I came to tell you that I understand now what you were trying to do by living modestly. You wanted to know if I loved you for who you are." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and I failed that test spectacularly. I studied my daughter's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but all I saw was genuine remorse and a profound sadness that reminded me of the little girl who used to cry when she thought she'd disappointed me. "What will you do now?" I asked. I'm moving back to Sacramento. Mom's house is still in my name, and there's a small family practice there that's willing to give me a second chance. It won't be glamorous, but maybe that's what I need." She stood up, smoothing down her dress. "I also wanted you to know that I'm going to counseling, trying to understand how I became someone I don't recognize." As she moved toward the door, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, that would take time, if it ever came at all, but something softer than the anger I'd carried for months. "Sloane?" She turned back, hope flickering in her eyes. "Your mother would be proud of you for taking responsibility." The smile that crossed her face was small and sad, but it was the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in years. After she left, Patricia looked at me with raised eyebrows. "How do you feel?" "Empty," I said honestly, but not in a bad way, like I've finally put down something heavy I've been carrying for too long. 6 months after that encounter, I was reviewing applications for the Foundation's first round of legal aid grants when my assistant knocked on my office door. "Mr. Matthews, there's a package for you, no return address." Inside the small box was a photo I hadn't seen in 20 years. It showed 5-year-old Sloane sitting on my lap, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. On the back, in handwriting I barely recognized, were 4 words, "I remember this, Dad." There was no note, no request for contact, no plea for reconciliation. Just an acknowledgement that once, before everything went wrong, we had been happy together. I set the photo on my desk next to the Foundation's mission statement and the quarterly reports from Morrison Industries. My life was fuller now than it had been in years. Purposeful work, genuine friendships, and the deep satisfaction that came from helping others who'd faced similar betrayals. I still missed Sloane sometimes, the daughter she'd been, and the relationship we might have had. But I'd learned that you could love someone and still choose to protect yourself from them. Some bridges could be rebuilt, others needed to stay burned for your own survival. The Foundation had helped over 200 elderly victims of financial abuse in its first year. We'd provided legal representation, counseling services, and most importantly, the knowledge that they weren't alone. Every case we won, every predator we stopped, every family we helped heal felt like a small victory against the darkness that had tried to consume me. That evening, I stood once again on my balcony, watching the city come alive with evening lights. Tomorrow I would review more grant applications, meet with potential donors, and continue building something meaningful from the ashes of my broken family. The man who had sat in that humiliating Christmas dinner, dismissed as a useless burden, was gone forever. In his place stood someone stronger, wiser, and finally free from the desperate need to be loved by people who saw him only as a source of wealth. Sometimes the greatest gift your enemies can give you is showing you exactly who they are. Sloane and Carlton had tried to erase me, but instead they'd helped me remember who I was meant to be. And for that, in a strange way, I was almost grateful.